Welcome to the Finding the Magic podcast, where books come alive. I'm Tricia Copeland, a fiction author and host of this show. If you love books, finding great reads, and hearing about the story behind the story directly from the authors, this is the place for you. Whether you like fantasy, science fiction, dystopian, or romance titles, I think you'll find something to love in my playlist. Listen in to discover something magical about a book or two today. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, thank you.
Today I have Michael Grayford here. He is a YA fantasy author, adventure, a little sci-fi and horror, correct?
Yeah, trying out some different things. We'll see if anything sticks.
Well, your first book is, you just have one book published so far?
Yeah, just the one. Yeah, the one.
Okay, so yeah, I love this cover. Golden Scarab of, now I'm going to say it wrong, Ballyhar,
Yeah,
right?
perfect.
Yay! And what is the series title?
The Tales of Zara.
Tales of Zara.
It
And
follows
why?
it
What
follows
got?
the main character through, a
Okay.
series of adventures. This is the first one.
Okay, so this is the main character's name,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And how did you choose this genre, this character, this setting? Jump in, tell us all about it.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So this comes from an idea back in the day when I used to make video games. In the 1990s, I was working on an adventure game, kind of like the old King's Quest style games. And one of the guys I worked with, Michael Legg, who I thanked in this book, because we were coming up with this idea for an Aladdin's type story set in the Arabian Nights universe, a simple adventure game, before all of the technology that we have now. They were a lot simpler back then. And it was a riff off of Aladdin, a lot of humor, a lot of fun settings, with genies and ifrits and things like that. So it kind of came out of that idea that was sticking in the back of my head for years. We never made that game. And then when I joined a writing club, we started talking about different stories, and this was just one of the ideas that was there. So I started writing an outline for it, and it ended up becoming something different, loosely based on that concept. A lot of my concepts, interestingly enough or humorously enough, come from video game ideas that I had back in the day. So I'm slowly working through writing novels about ideas I had. And then, of course, as you're writing and outlining and things like that, it becomes a totally different story. So it's inspired from that idea. I really loved Disney's Aladdin, and I really loved the Arabian Nights universe. So that's where this comes from. Yeah, I just find it a lot of fun. I base this more off of sort of Disney's Aladdin feel than the actual story of Aladdin, which I've read. I read through all of the 1001 Nights, Aladdin, Alibaba, all those stories. And the original Aladdin story is very different than the Disney story.
Yeah.
So I focused mine more towards Disney. I took some things from the original Aladdin story, but then obviously I made it its own unique world. I made its own world building. Obviously, the main character is a girl in this story, and I tried to twist some of the tropes, turn some of the things on their head. So it's not just an Aladdin retelling. It's that's sort of the genesis of the idea, and that's sort of the feel that I wanted to get across. But it becomes its own thing. I call it an Arabian Nights story meets Tomb Raider or Indiana Jones, something like that.
Oh, fun. So Zara is a little bit of an adventurer, willing to take some risks and things like that.
Yeah. She starts off as a servant in the Sultan's palace, and she wants to, advance in the ranks and be able to do more than what she's able to right at that time. She's basically has nothing. She owns nothing. She's just a little peon in the palace. So that's sort of where she starts. She doesn't really know exactly what's out there, what's going on in the world. She just knows she doesn't want to be in her station that she's at now. And then she runs into the prince and immediately becomes smitten with the prince. And then a love spell gets placed on the prince, and he accidentally falls in love with her instead of the intended target. And now the vizier wants her dead, basically. So she has to run for her life, and she goes in search of the golden scarab of Ballyhar because it supposedly has a genie, and she's hoping this genie can help undo the spell and get her back into good graces and things like that. And then, of course, once she's out of the palace and out and about, she's roaming and adventuring, and there's riddles and puzzles and traps and things like that. So that's where the sort of Indiana Jones, Tomb Raider
Right.
type thing comes in.
Fun. That sounds like a lot of fun. And how did you pick? Well, I mean, you kind of told us how you picked the story. Why did you pick a female character?
Yeah, it's funny. This when I was originally doing the outline, it wasn't a female character. I had it as a male character, and one of my writing partners suggested, why don't you make it a girl instead of a boy, or a young woman instead of a young man? Maybe it's a better way to say it. And as soon as she said that, I started thinking of how it would play out. And it ended up being such a better story, I think. And I really like the character a lot more. I think it just works for the theme of the story a lot better as having a female as opposed to a male. So it wasn't originally my idea. So I have to give my writing partner credit. She came up with the idea and it worked. She comes up with lots of good ideas.
Right. Yeah, it's good to have people like that who you can bounce things off of.
Yeah, for sure. I have a couple of really good writing critique partners, and they're great. They help me a lot.
Yeah, so it seems like maybe making her female would make her a little more vulnerable to, her surroundings and the people around her, as well as maybe I don't know how females were regarded in that time setting, but over history, it has been a little bit more that they were a little bit more disadvantaged. So maybe she gave her more to overcome in a sense.
Yeah, it definitely gave her more of a chance to step up in a way that maybe wouldn't be as expected. Like if it was a male in that role, it would probably feel more generic. And I think that's sort of what my original concept was. It felt a little bit more generic.
Right.
And this opened it up a lot more. And like you said, it certainly was a different time period. And I didn't want to make it realistic, like a historical fiction for that time period. I think, women didn't have sort of the openness that they do today. Everyone wore a veil. Well, I guess in some societies today, maybe that's still the case, but back then, certainly it was a little more constrained, and, women were more subdued. And it didn't really make sense for this story to do that if I wanted to have an action adventure where the character could go out and do things. So
right.
I definitely take some creative license. It's not a historical fiction. It's more of like riffing off of that mythology than that history.
Fun. And why YA? Just your video game background, or?
Well, maybe that's part of it, but we at the time when we had all my critique partners, there were me and two others, there were a couple, and we had all written a book and read at least parts of each other's books, and there was a lot of feedback, and we're still just learning about writing, and it wasn't this book, it was a different book. And we realized, okay, we're going to need to get some more experience here. And we listened to people like Brandon Sanderson, who said it took him like 8 books before he got published. And we said, okay, let's just write like 3, 5, 10, 8, however many it takes. Let's write some fast books, get them out, right? Get through the experience. And we had also been looking at submitting to publishers and submitting to contests and things like that. And we noticed middle grade was sort of an underserved genre. So you have a younger audience. So we thought, well, it'd be easier if we want to submit this somewhere to do a middle grade story, because there's less competition, number one. And number two, those books are a lot shorter than doing like the first book that I wrote was an epic fantasy, which was like 130,000 words.
Wow.
So it started off as a middle grade story, actually. We were just writing it as a test. It was like, we're just going to bang a few books out. And this was the first one of that test that I did. And I finished and I thought, this isn't bad. I kind of like this. I wouldn't mind having my name on it, if it got published in the world. So I went through numerous editing processes and got it to where it's like, okay, I'm happy with this, and submitted it. And I upgraded the age a little bit, so it's more YA, but it's probably accurately put right between them, right? It's like upper middle grade or lower young adult. So it's definitely more family friendly. Anybody could read this story. There's nothing gratuitous in any sense, really. It's probably rated G, maybe PG for a little violence or something, but it's very family friendly story. So it's sort of right in between that. I don't know if there's a word for, upper middle grade, lower young adult, but
Yeah, I think you hit it, like lower YA, upper
yeah, like lower YA. It's only lower YA because some of the themes are a little bit more adult, right? She's out on her own. She's 16 years old at the start. The prince is 17 years old, who also ends up traveling with her. So it's aged up a notch from middle grade.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and sometimes, the age of the character, but also, like you said, this is more like an Indiana Jones, not very gruesome or anything, like fun adventure, not like dark adventure. So
Yeah.
that can be a 12 plus audience, 11 plus audience sometimes. So
Yeah, it's not it's not what is a sort of a common young adult dystopian type, fiction story. It's definitely not that. It's more of a lighter action adventure story, kind of calling back to a lot of those old movies, Sinbad and things like that as well. I intend to go in that direction, with the rest of the series. I'm thinking it'll probably end up being 4 books. I have the second one, first draft, written now, and I just got feedback from my critique partner, so I've got a bunch of editing to do on that one, and then probably 2 more. I don't know. We'll see. I haven't fully fleshed out the entire series. I just have like some loose ideas for where this is going, but I do intend to bring in other characters from the Arabian Nights universe, like Alibaba, Sinbad, maybe even have Aladdin in there at some point, to bring in some of those characters and play with them. And they'll be, when I say I bring them in, it's like not bringing them in as they were written. They're going to be my own characters, my own takes on those,
right.
and fitting them into Zara's universe. Zara's definitely going to be the main character throughout, with some of the other characters that she has picked up in the first book.
Fun. So set us up the second book. Where is Zara in the second book?
Yeah, so in the second book, it takes place in Egypt, and it's more Egyptian mythology. So the first one's Arabian mythology, obviously, and I still have those elements in it, and it still feels like the same world, hopefully. But I also bring in the mythology of the ancient Egyptian gods, in particular Sekhmet. She's one of the gods from Egyptian mythology. The story is called The Wrath of Sekhmet. So they go down, Zara goes down there in search of information for her long lost mother, and sort of through an accidental sequence of events ends up unleashing this goddess Sekhmet, who's been contained for thousands of years. And Sekhmet was not too happy about being contained, so hence the wrath of Sekhmet. She's quite upset about that, so they have to find a way to try to stop her or deal with her or something like that. And it blends in riddles, puzzles, traps, kind of the things we've come to expect from the Egyptian ethos, right? Like that world of, you go into an old pyramid and there's traps in there and there's curses and things like that. They're not necessarily there in real life, but we've kind of come to expect that, with shows like The Mummy and things like that. So I definitely include a lot of that stuff in there. And there's other gods from ancient Egypt who come into play, and there's a lot of mythology things that I play with. But again, it's still mostly, intended to be a fun action adventure story.
Right. Yeah. And I think in some of the information you gave me ahead of time, you mentioned like some of your favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson, Brandon Mull. I definitely get that feel from maybe your book is similar. Did you read those on your own, or do you have kids you read them to? Because that's how I discovered them.
No, I read them on my own. I think, let's see, with Brandon Mull, I believe a friend recommended those to me. I read the Beyonders trilogy. I don't know if you've read those.
I think I've read one of them and I can't remember which one it is now.
Yeah.
I know what happens. Like the guy works in a zoo and he gets eaten by a hippopotamus.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I really liked it. Some books, I think the older I get, the more it takes for a book to really grab me and pull me in. And if I don't know why, for some reason, that series, the Beyonder series, really hooked me. Like after a few chapters, I was like, I was engaged. And it wasn't so much like, deep character development, right, for the main characters through the story. But it was just, I think of a lot of it was just the action adventure of it where each chapter, like, oh, there's a new little puzzle the characters have to figure. I love that stuff. So I mean, part of that comes from probably my video game background as well, the sort of puzzling things out, and what's the quest and what's the conflict, or what's the obstacle that I have to get around and deal with. I
Right.
really
How
like
do you
those
find the
things.
magic key?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that's probably why. And it's very, his writing is very fast paced. And Sanderson, with the Mistborn, I haven't read too much of him. I read the Mistborn, and I've read the Reckoners, which is another like YA faster paced story. I tend to appreciate that more. Now it's harder for me to get into books that are slower paced and really take their time. I think it's part of the nature of modern society with so much information constantly blasted at us. It's a shame, but that's where we're at.
For me, it was I felt like it wasn't, I don't know, maybe it was getting older, but I felt like as soon as I became an author and went through the editing process and really learned how to write, like if the writing is not good, if it doesn't grab me right away, that I think that influenced me more than anything. Like if I pick up a book and I don't like how it's written, or every sentence is was, I can't do it. I just like I can't believe I read Twilight back in the day. Like every sentence is was. I mean, it's a great story, but I can't do it anymore. So
Yeah, it's a problem, right? Because you're analyzing story structure and character development and line by
yeah.
line writing, all of it, like every aspect of writing, you're analyzing it yourself, and you can't help but doing that to do that to other people's stories as well. I find it easier with movies and TV. I can just kind of sit back. I don't know, it's more passive, and there's it's an audio visual experience as well, so it's easier to distract me from story issues
The black
sometimes.
and white words on the page.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, I feel the same way. I had trouble getting into Harry Potter for that reason. I didn't read Harry Potter when it was popular. I didn't watch the movies. And then actually once I joined my writing group, they were talking about Harry Potter. There's, the guy who ran it said, you need to read Harry Potter because, there's so much, it's so popular and there's so much reference to it that you sort of need that as a base. And I was like, yeah, that's probably true. So I went back and read the first one and was like, man, this is not that great. It starts off very childish. Obviously, it's a very much younger audience, but her writing is, it breaks like all of the rules in that first book. But then once it gets going, she gets better as a writer. The stories get tighter, plots get better. It starts, having more character development. So I ended up reading all of the Harry Potters and watching all the movies, and it was fun, and I enjoyed it eventually.
That's interesting. I'm probably the only person on earth who has not read or watched a Harry Potter movie or read a book. So I apologize in advance to all the people that love Harry Potter. Anyway. Well, I love that you've brought in this mythology concept, because there's so many people that are into mythology too. And that has a big following.
Yeah, and it seems like more of the common mythologies are like Greek mythology, for example, with Percy Jackson and things like that. And we've seen that. I've read a number of stories like that. A friend of mine is working on a different type of mythology. I don't know. I like tapping into those elements from the past, but obviously I don't want to just retell that story. I want to use it more as inspired by that.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're doing something like typical medieval fantasy, right? You can be inspired by Tolkien, but don't create the same thing. I think we already,
right.
I love Terry Brooks, right? But he wrote the Shannara series, the Sword of Shannara, and all of those. And the Sword of Shannara, I think, is really hard for a lot of people to read these days because it reads so much like a rehash of Lord of the Rings, because that's kind of what it was intended to do. And then he moves away from that in later books, and they get better, I think. But yeah, I don't think most of us want to do that, right? We don't want to rehash something that's already been there. So yeah, I like to just take inspiration from it and change it, right? If you read this story, you'll see that it's like, wait, this doesn't work like how other stories like this did things. Like I had my roommate read it, and she said, I don't like this. It doesn't work like this other story. I'm like, it's not supposed to be the same. It's supposed to be different. That's the whole point.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people like it and it's different and people like it. So
Yeah, no, I think it's fun. I try to twist some of the tropes on their head. I think if you go into that with that expectation, like this isn't just, Aladdin, or this isn't just, Alibaba or whatever. It's like this is inspired by those works. And I do my own world building with it. I make my own rules for the world and the magic system and things like that.
fun. And so when you go at a project like this, or when you're doing projects, do you plan the whole book out? Do you have like a board with little white sticky or yellow stickies, or how do you do that?
Yeah, there's the people who just sort of discovery write, right? They sit down, they have, maybe even just a vague idea and they just write. And then there's people who plot everything out. I'm definitely more in the plot everything out side of things. My first book, I didn't do that. I just started writing and it was a miserable experience. Like, what happens next? I don't know. So I just wrote. I think a lot of people enjoy that, what happens next, and they just see where it goes. That is definitely not for me, at least not yet. Maybe I will get to that point once I have, 20 books under my belt or something. But for now, I definitely do lots of outlining, lots of, setting up the characters and what the turns are going to be in the story, the twists and the conflicts. I know who the bad guy is going to be. I know, what the climax is going to be at the end of the story. For me, that's a huge thing because I want the story to wrap up and have a culmination that feels satisfying.
Right.
And to do that, you really have to lay the groundwork along the way, right? In each chapter, in each act. And you can certainly do that by just sitting down and writing and not planning it out. But that usually involves a lot of editing after you're done, like, oh, well, I needed to do all this and this and this. And even with me planning it out, I still have a lot of editing to do. So I don't need more. I'm not a huge fan of the editing process. I know some people love editing. That's not me. So with each book that I write, I try to get more and more done up front so that when I sit it down and write it, the first draft is closer to the final draft. That's my goal. I'm not even remotely there yet, but that's one of the reasons I like that. And also when I sit down to write, I'm never just staring at a blank page saying, okay, now what? At that point, there's no writer's block ever, because I know what to write. It's right there. I have the outline for it. And the outline might be a few sentences, or it might be like 500, 800 words of just ideas or dialogue or events that happen in this particular scene. But I generally know what's going to happen. So I can sit down on any given day and write a scene.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You seem to have like a very technical side of you and then a very creative side that are meshing well in this case.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love writing. That's one of the reasons I love video games. And I think that has carried over into creating novels, because you do need to have both those parts of your brain, right? It's fun to be creative and come up with all these ideas and have characters go off into, weird situations, and how are they going to handle this, throwing obstacles in front of them and seeing how they get around them, all those little twists and turns, playing with character relationships, all that stuff is very creative and very fun. But at the end of the day, you have to write a coherent story that makes sense, builds upon itself, and then is satisfying in its conclusion. And that inevitably requires that logical side of your brain. So you definitely need both. And obviously some people are more skewed towards one or the other. And that's great. Right? We can read different stories and appreciate them for the type of stories they are. That's fantastic. But I love blending those two things together.
Yeah, and books have so many different layers too. Like you said, you have the plot line and you have the unexpected twist, but then you also have the characters and the development and maybe pressure from the outside that are like characters in and of itself, like weather could be a character, or all those different things that can play in to, I guess, what am I thinking? Not goals, problems for your character. My mind was blanking there, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I always try to make setting an important part of the story. It's not necessarily, I don't know. I try to make it at least have something to do with the obstacles that the character has to face,
right?
Or they interact with it in some way that it's meaningful. It's not just another place that they go to, if possible, right? Sometimes you want that. You don't want every setting that the character goes through. Certainly if it's a quest story like these are, to be like this grand setting, right? It's like that would be overwhelming to the reader. It's like, okay, this thing's big, and now this thing's big, and now this thing's big. It becomes too much. You want to kind of have an ebb and flow to it, right? But if you're describing a setting and the characters interacting with that setting, it makes sense to have it be something that's meaningful and either helps propel the plot along or stop the plot, for the character. Like, okay, they hit some kind of problem here because of this location, or something happens here that wouldn't happen somewhere else. Those things are interesting to me, and I think I get to play with that a lot more in fantasy settings like this than maybe, if it's sort of a real world story. Real world stories, like, okay, if they're in this building, maybe they do something special with that building, but it's kind of a known place.
Right.
I like coming up with my own places if I can.
There aren't magic rooms in real buildings.
As far as we've been able to tell, that's the case.
But dude, you're in a multiverse, and I don't really understand how that works, but my husband definitely believes in it, so it must be a thing. So
yeah, I'm with your husband on that one.
So talk to me about the other side of your brain. You're working on an epic fantasy, correct? And a sci-fi horror?
Yes, yeah. So the first book I wrote is an epic fantasy story with, I don't know, there's like 7 or 8 POV characters through the story. So that was a lot to bite off on as my first book. Like I said, it's 130,000 words. It needs a lot of work. It's still there. In that universe, I have planned probably at least 9 books. I mean, it's sort of a trilogy of trilogies, like Star Wars ended up being. But I guess if the first trilogy doesn't do anything, then it will just end at 3. But I have plans for at least 9 to write, like the main story I have plotted out. And then there could also be more, way back in time, like thousands of years before the first story that you read, kind of setting up how the world came to be the way it is. And then there could be stories afterward. I have some loose ideas for those things. But yeah, the first one is a trilogy, and then I can expand it to 9. And that's sort of it's a world where there were dragons, but there aren't anymore. But the magic is intrinsically tied to what the dragons were and what they did in the past. And the people now are dealing with how that affects them. And there's kind of this separation of 2 different locations geographically that have kind of created cultural civilizations on their own. They've been separated. So they're very different. It's kind of like if when the Europeans came to the Americas, right? There were already people there and they had their own culture, very different from the European culture. Or when you go to Asia, they're very different culture there. Similar kind of thing, but in a magical world. And one of those sides has more magic than the other one. It's more like intrinsic. And there's a conflict that I don't want to get into the whole story of that, but that's sort of the epic fantasy. There's a lot of potential there. I had set that aside until, I get a few books out and get some more experience with writing and plotting and all that stuff and character development. But now that I started Zara series, the Tales of Zara series, I'll probably definitely finish this first before going back to that. And the other story is a science fiction story. All of my stories, I'm kind of focusing on my brand, I guess, as sort of action adventure. My goal isn't necessarily to be delving into super deep philosophy or, I don't want to get too deep in things. There might be some of that in there, but at least for now, most of them are going to be, action adventure, fun. I try to inject humor in all my stories. So the science fiction ones is the same. It's still very actiony. I originally intended to write it as kind of a thriller / horror. I called it Die Hard meets Aliens, if you're familiar with those movies. So kind of blending those 2 concepts. After I wrote it, I feel like it's probably more thriller than horror, which I guess makes sense given the inspirations for the story. And that's fine. I want to go through and edit it. I'll have to decide if I want to punch up horror aspects or just keep it more actiony sci-fi. This series is a lot more adult than the Zara series. It's definitely not for kids. It's a lot more adult in terms of themes and violence and swearing and things like that. So just to be clear on that. And that story is actually available. The rough draft of that story is available on Kindle Vella, Amazon's serial platform. So it's
Right.
like it's out there.
What is the name of that one?
The Deep Dark.
The Deep Dark. Okay.
Yeah. So that's
fun.
Yeah. Bear in mind that is the rough draft. I was like, well, I'll just throw the rough draft up here. I didn't really know what Kindle Vella was going on at the time. So, but that one also needs a lot of editing because I usually go through a few edits after my first draft. But it is there. It is there. The core of the story is there, and it won't change too much probably. And then I think those were the three. And then I'm working on sequels to, the Golden Scarab of Ballyhar, obviously as well.
Right. Fun. Well, so do you write all these at the same time, or do you do one project and then, okay, I'm through with that one and then do the next?
It's a little bit of an overlap, but what I've found for me, mostly I have to focus on one thing at a time. So the epic fantasy I wrote, and then that was done. I did one edit pass on it, but it needs a lot more. It needs to be restructured actually, and probably mostly rewritten from the ground up. And then I wrote Zara, and then I wrote The Deep Dark, and then I wrote the sequel to the first Zara story, The Wrath of Sekhmet. And then I also did a little bit I have been doing a little bit of editing on The Deep Dark while I was waiting to get feedback on Zara 2. But now I've gotten that feedback, so I'm going to switch back to Zara 2. So mostly it's one at a time. I have these things going. I write down thoughts on them, as they come up, but I'm not like working on two at a time, really. At least
right. Yeah, I was going to say that seems challenging because I feel like if I did that, I would have my my characters and my personalities like crossing over and mixing up.
Yeah, I could see that being a problem, especially if it's something similar. Like if they're both in fantasy worlds and the characters are kind of similar. Yeah, that would definitely be a problem. Luckily, mine have been very different so far, so it's pretty easy to keep them separated in my mind.
Right. Yeah. I always have like character sheets on top of what I'm writing, so I remember their personalities and their major traits, so I'm not veering too much from that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I use Scrivener, and I tend to put character sheets as a separate folder in there. I don't use like Post-it notes or corkboard or anything like that, like real in the physical world. I tend to write it all on the computer. I think I used computers from when I was young, when they were first coming out as personal computers. So it became very familiar to me. I would always do, research papers or essays for school or whatever on the computer. So it's just natural to me to work that way. But yeah, I do the same thing. I create character sheets and plot sheets and relationship documents, and I have, World Bible. I think a World Bible is critical if you're doing more than one book and you're doing like a fantasy or science fiction story of your own making. You have to keep these elements consistent, right? And you need to know when was this character there, or how did this thing come about? So I try to keep a World Bible. I'm not as super meticulous about that as I've seen some people are, but those definitely.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I talked to one author, and I think she has 20 books or more than 20 books, but she writes every scene in an Excel file. And for every book of every character goes in an Excel file. I was like, wow, because I could not, like, I probably should do more of that and more. And then I talked to someone who like outlined after she was writing. So at least she had it down and could go back and reference it quickly rather than reading the whole book again to figure out where it was. But I'm more like, can I find this word in my last book to see what I did? So, yeah.
Well, how do you write? Because some people do their first drafts like with pen and paper, which just seems crazy to me. But
I did that like when I first started writing, but like 15 years ago. And then my husband was like, here, I bought you a computer. But yeah, like obviously I'm not as like I'm more physical than I am. It sounds like you're definitely more electronic and your brain can work in that way. So yeah.
Yeah, I do like writing by hand. And when I started my first book, I did a lot of that just in terms of outline or maybe some scenes or dialogue. I tend to get like dialogue interactions like popping up in my brain between characters that helps me flesh out a scene. So I write a lot of that stuff down. But now, yeah, now I mostly do it on the computer or on my phone. I'll write little notes to myself on the phone and then incorporate that later.
Fun. Well, this has been awesome. I loved hearing about all your work, and I'm going to look them up because I think it's right up my alley. Tell us where we can find you, all the website, Instagram, whatever you are doing out there.
Sure, yeah. The best place to go is michaelgrayford.com, which has links at the bottom of the page to all of my other socials. So if you want to check out I tend to post most and interact most on Facebook. So that's probably my primary place, but I also post on Instagram. I have a TikTok, which I don't really use. I was posting some silly TikTok videos and YouTube videos back in the day of me just talking about my goals for the day, my writing goals for the day. It's really stupid, just me doing like stupid voices and looking around weird, just to have fun with it. But yeah, I haven't posted to those in a while. I'll get back to that at some point. But yeah, michaelgrayford.com is sort of the hub. You go there and you can check out any of the other social medias.
Well, good. Thank you. And the question I usually ask at the end is one I think you've already answered, but what is your overall goal? What do you want your reader to experience when they read one of your books?
Yeah. I certainly, I think I touched on that, but I guess I want people to feel like this was a good escape. I'm not, I don't want to say it's pretentious, but I'm not trying to like change anyone's life with my stories, if that makes sense. I'm trying to make it, you go into this other world and you experience this other reality and you have fun. Maybe there's some tension. Hopefully you laugh along the way, and then it has a very satisfying conclusion. And you feel like, oh, that was something fun. That was enjoyable. And you feel like you got entertainment value out of it. That's primarily what I'm going for. I do inject themes as part of the story to kind of carry the whole plot through and what the characters are doing. So that's there in the background, but it's not necessarily, I'm not trying to hammer you over the head with it. I just want people to have some of the joy that I had when I was younger, playing video games, watching movies, watching TV. I want to put that out into the world.
That feels really good. I mean, when I pick up a fiction book, that's what I want. If I'm going to improve myself, I will go for nonfiction.
Right, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Michael Grayford of michaelgrayford.com. And hopefully you'll be back when you finish some other books.
Cool. Thank you very much, Tricia. This has been great.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Finding the Magic podcast. I'm your host, author and podcaster Tricia Copeland, and I love getting behind the scenes. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe and stop in each week to discover new authors and books. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep finding the magic.